Hey guys, it's Mr. Farrell. Uh, Here is our video to explain some of the things that we've talked about for this week, or you guys have been studying for this week. So you have watched a video and you've taken some notes. So this is the part where I'm going to kind of talk through some stuff, kind of relate it back to what we've talked about already, kind of tell you where we're going with this sort of stuff, and hopefully make some of this make sense if it was confusing. So you have just done the organelle notes. So you should have watched the video. You should have filled out the PDF. These two things go together. Little side note with PDFs, if you're still having problems, take a look up here at the very top. This helps for read and write for Google Tools. This post right here, it's going to live at the top of the page. There's a video that I made that will help to hopefully give you some tips. And if that doesn't fix it, we can go and look into these slides. This is something else that you may not have done. So if you're having issues working with the PDFs, you would check that out. But that's not this video. So we've clicked into this and we've watched the video, we filled this out. So we're going to focus more on the backside here. So if I go too fast, take a second, stop the video, kind of type in some stuff. We're going to make sure that you guys have the right notes. And I'm going to also kind of talk about some stuff. So last week you were looking at cell size. Why were cells so small? You should have figured out that they were small because of the surface area to volume ratio. That allows smaller cells are able to get things in quickly. So things like food, water, oxygen, they can get in quickly. It's efficient and it works better than a larger cell. Another thing that we talked about that you learned about, hopefully we've talked about it, is the idea of two main kinds of cells. We have prokaryotes and we have eukaryotes. So prokaryotes, eukaryotes. Now, prokaryotes, there's a helpful rhyme to remember the difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. So the rhyme was in the video, a video you watched last week that was in the Nearpod, and the rhyme was pro no, you do. So what does that mean? Well, prokaryotes have no nucleus and eukaryotes do have a nucleus. So you do means eukaryotes do have a nucleus. There's something else that goes along with this, is something called membrane-bound organelles. So membrane-bound organelles are things that are in eukaryotic cells. No nucleus, no membrane-bound organelles. Eukaryotes do have membrane-bound organelles, and they do have a nucleus. So this is what that word organelle, if you look at it, it kind of looks like organs. And we're not talking about like the organ that you hear at church, not the musical instrument. We're talking about organs as in like parts of your body. So most of you guys are getting to the age to where you either have your learner's permit or driver's license and you're getting on the road. And one of the things that you fill out when you get your permit or your license is, would you like to be an organ donor? Well, what does that mean? Well, that means if you were to pass, then you would donate your organs you could donate. So, well, what are those organs? Those are things like your heart, your liver, your lungs, brain. All those are organs. And the heart does something different. It looks different than the lung. So it has a different structure or a different build, and it has a different function as well. The heart does a different job than the lungs do. The liver looks different than the heart, and it does a different job. Well, just like your body has those organs that do different jobs, your cells have different organelles that do different jobs as well. It's just cells are just tiny versions of you. So this week we're focusing on those organelles, and we're focusing on what do they look like, what are their jobs, and things like that. So there is a lot, and you're just going to have to memorize them. We're going to try to give you guys some things to think about. Some we have really good examples. Some you may put whatever you're thinking. So time to get started here. So the first thing we have is the cell membrane. Now, sometimes you see it called the cell membrane. Sometimes it'll be called the plasma membrane. It just depends on what we're looking at. They're the same thing. We're talking about the same thing. So the cell membrane, the function or the job is it's going to surround the cell. It's the thing on the outside, so it keeps everything inside the cell, and it's going to control or it's going to select what enters and exits the cell. This idea is called selectively permeable. So the cell membrane is going to select what can come in, it's going to select what can go out. So if something comes up to the cell and the cell membrane is going to kind of check it, kind of like security would, and it's going to say, what are you? And if it's something useful, maybe it's something like food or water, it may let it come in. If it's something that's not useful or hurtful, it may, like a virus or bacteria, it'll say, nope, you can't come in. So it's going to choose what can come in and come out. Well, why do we get, I just said it would stop viruses and stop bacteria. Well, why do we get sick? Why do we get things like the flu or COVID or whatever? Well, that's because viruses will sometimes disguise themselves. And I'm oversimplifying things. They'll disguise themselves. They will have different proteins on them and different markers that basically the cell recognizes as something else, almost like a mask or a disguise. But that's more of a separate video topic. We're coming back here. We're still talking about the cell membrane. So just like security, it's going to check what can come in and come out. So the examples that I'm giving you, that what it makes you think of, this is going to be things that remind you of the job. So the idea is that if you can remember the cell membrane is like a fence, that will help you remember what the job is. So instead of remembering this whole thing, if you can remember the cell membrane's like security or a cell membrane's like a fence, you already know what the job of a fence is and the job of security is. That'll help you kind of remember this. So it's called making connections, and that's one of the things that help you learn. So next thing we're going to talk about is the cytoplasm. The cytoplasm is basically the filling. It's kind of a jelly-like filling, and one of the things that it does is it holds the organelles in place. And so that way organelles aren't bouncing around, and it kind of helps gives the cell a little, kind of holds things together. Now, the cell membrane and the cytoplasm, these are found in both prokaryotes and eukaryotes. So I know we said no. Well, these aren't really membrane-bound organelles. Neither is the ribosome. You look, ribosome is both. Neither is the ribosome. So these are some things that are found in all cells. Now, speaking of the ribosomes make proteins, and proteins are really useful. You're probably, when you hear the word protein, you're probably thinking of things like meat and building muscle and those sorts of things. But proteins have a lot of different jobs. So proteins are responsible for making muscle. There's also proteins that have different jobs, such as hemoglobin. If you've heard of hemoglobin before, hemoglobin is a protein that's in your blood cells, your red blood cells, and it's responsible for carrying oxygen. So that's what allows those red blood cells to carry oxygen. And so that helps you get oxygen to your cells. So if somebody is anemic, they have low hemoglobin levels. And one of the things that's happening at the school this next week is the blood drive. So it's happening next Friday. And one of the things that they check is your hemoglobin levels. Well, that's one of those things. We want to make sure if someone's getting blood from a donation, well, we want to make sure they're getting enough oxygen. So that's why we check that. Next thing we have is the nucleus. The nucleus is like the brain of the cell. And why is it like the brain of the cell? Well, it contains the instructions. We call that DNA. You've heard of DNA. When you think DNA, you're thinking of the instructions or the information. Sometimes we call it genetic material or genetic info. So it contains the cell's genetic instructions. It contains the genetic material, and it controls all activities of the cell, kind of like your brain. Your brain tells your body what to do, and it has all your information up here. It has all your memories, all the stuff that you learned. It has all that stuff up there, kind of like your brain. So this is in eukaryotes, remember we said pro, no, do. So eukaryotes do have the nucleus. Prokaryotes do not. Next thing we have is the endoplasmic reticulum. So we have two different ERs. We call these ERs for short. So we have a smooth ER and we have a rough ER. And they look different. And since they look different, kind of like your heart and your liver look different, or your heart and your lungs look different, they have different jobs. So the smooth ER, we call it smooth because it looks smooth. It does not have bumps on it. And what this is responsible for is detoxification. So getting rid of things such as drugs, poisons, stuff like that. And it's also going to make lipids, otherwise known as fats. So that's the job of the smooth ER. Now the rough ER is rough because it looks bumpy. If we look at it, it has bumps on it. Well, what are those bumps? Those are those ribosomes. And so since it has ribosomes are involved in protein, the rough DR is involved with making protein. So it's going to have some role in making proteins. And so this is a membrane-bound organelle. So this is found in eukaryotes. Now, we have the Golgi body, or the Golgi apparatus. So the Golgi apparatus is sometimes called the Golgi body. And so this is going to receive, package, and ship proteins and lipids out of the cell. And so if we're thinking receiving, packaging, shipping, that sounds like the post office. That's what the post office or UPS or FedEx does. And so it has a very similar job. That's why we put those things there. Now, one thing that a teacher told me, and I will never get it out of my head now, is they just gave me a silly little saying. So what they said, this is the GOPO. And so what we mean by that is the GO, Golgi, PO, post office. So the GO is the PO, or the post office. And so hopefully that helps. Hopefully that's kind of catchy and helps you remember that. And this is also found in eukaryotes. Now, next is something that most people usually remember. This is probably one, other than the nucleus, this is probably one of the most popular organelles, the mighty mitochondria. So the mighty mitochondria, or just the mitochondria, is the powerhouse of the cell, or it's a power plant. And so we call it a power plant because what it does is it makes energy. So it takes the food that you eat and it makes energy, and that energy is called something called ATP. And we'll talk about ATP later in the year. So eukaryotes are going to have this. Now, it says in both plant and animal cells. Some of the things we're going to talk about next, they're just in animal cells or just in plant cells or something like that. So we are making that distinction there. Next thing is the cell wall. So the cell wall, it has the word wall in it. Well, it's going to do the job of a wall, kind of like the walls of your house. It's going to protect you. It's going to provide support. So just like the walls of your house protect you from things like rain, really hot temperatures, really cold temperatures, things like that, it's going to protect us well. And it's going to provide support. So it's going to support the rest of the cell. So just like your walls of your house provide support for the roof. And one thing about this is just in plant cells. It is in some, or if we're talking eukaryotes, it is in prokaryotes, but if we're talking eukaryotes, it's not in all eukaryotes. Animal cells do not have a cell wall. Only plant cells do. Moving on, we have the chloroplast. So the chloroplast, this is something that's in plant cells. Not all eukaryotes, just plant cells. And what this is responsible for photosynthesis. So you should have learned in 9th grade in environmental science, photosynthesis is the process of using sunlight to make something called glucose. That's the plant's food. So this captures energy from the sun to make food, which eventually the plant uses to make energy. So this is very similar to a solar panel. Just like a solar panel uses the sun's light and makes electricity, the chloroplast is going to use sunlight and make energy, just not electricity. It's just food, glucose specifically. Next thing we have is the vacuole. Now, vacuoles, they're storage tanks. So they store different things depending on what the cell needs to store. It'll store things such as water, food, sometimes waste if it's needed. But one of the big things that we need to make sure that you guys know is that it is larger in plant cells. If you look at a plant cell and an animal cell, you'll see a big difference in vacuoles. You'll see it really, really big in plants and kind of just normal and look like everything else in animal cells. And if you look at the plant cell, it takes up a lot of the plant cell. Well, why is that? What does the plant need? What does it need to store more than animal cells do? Well, it's going to be water. Plants, when you're thirsty, when you're an animal, when you're thirsty, you can just go get a drink of water whenever you feel like it. Now, plant cells, when they're thirsty, they can't get up and go get a drink of water like you did. So they have to store it and have extra on hand just in case. And so that's why it's so big. Um, and that's why when a plant hasn't been watered for a long time, it's going to start to wilt and droop and look kind of sad. And it's not dying, but it's just needs water. And so that's why when you water your plant, if it's like drooping and wilting, it perks back up and it looks just like everything's fine. It just looks like brand new. So we compare this to things like a bag. Someone said a desk in class because desks hold things and store things. I think it kind of looks like a pool in the plant cells because it's so big. Um, so those are some of the organelles. Like I said, you're going to have to just memorize these, kind of just work with these. So later in the lesson, when you go on to the Nearpod, you're going to do some practice. You're going to talk about what kind of cells these are in, and like maybe some of the jobs. What do they do? Some stuff like that. So hope this helps. I hope that if you had anything that was confusing, I hope it makes a little more sense now. And we'll see you guys